So now model 4 is a slight variant of the earlier models in the following manner. Farm 1 has the ability to produce both final good and input at a cost C1. That's its marginal cost of production of input. Farm 2 can produce only final good. So now we are truncating the Farm 2's ability by reducing its option to produce in-house. So maybe because it doesn't have technology or something, it can only specialize in the downstream activity, upstream activity, it's beyond its scope, ability, or whatever be the reason. So Farm 2 is just in the final good market. Farm 1 can be in both market. Both market means has the ability to produce input in-house. Farm 3, it does not participate in the final good sector. So downstream activity for Farm 3 is 0. It can't produce the final good, but it is a input seller and it produces the input at a cost C0. Okay. Now, depending on this value C1 and this C0, there will be different parameter configurations, which one is greater, which one is lower, and then accordingly the characterization will occur. But to see the main results of this particular paper is the following, that Farm 1 has the ability to produce both, but it may not like to do so. Why? Because it might like to outsource in order to take certain advantage in the final goods competition stage. So let us look at the 3-stage game. Stage 1, Farm 1 and 3 announce prices P1 and P3. So these are prices of input announced by the farms who can produce input. So Farm 1 can produce input, Farm 3 is essentially the input seller. So P1 and P3 are the input prices and they compete in that prices to supply input in the market. Stage 2, Farm 2, after observing prices, decide to place its order of inputs with one of the farms. So remember this Farm 2, it doesn't have the ability to produce input, but it can place its order with one of the farm. Okay. And then in the 3rd stage, Farm 1 and Farm 2, they will be competing in quantity. So here we are assuming that that the choice variable for the two farms are quantities. Okay. And here the interesting thing that will come up is the following. So now remember that P1, so suppose P1 is greater than P3. So which means that Farm 1 has chosen some input price for the input market, which is greater than the input price chosen by the input supplier. Now, even if this particular configuration holds, even then Farm 2, after observing prices, might like to place its order with Farm 1. So what does that mean? It is doing, it is buying input at a higher price, despite having the option of buying input at a lower price. And this will be done with the objective that Farm 2, by placing the order to Farm 1, can actually place the order of a leadership output. So imagine that in your simple Kurno case, you know that leader actually, with same cost of production, leader produces more than the follower, right? Okay. So if you just have the standard calculations, you know with C as the constant cost of production, leader produces more than the follower. Now, if Farm 2 places an order to Farm 1, which is its leadership quantity that would follow in the subsequent stages of the competition between the two parties, and if Farm 1 is accepting such an order, then Farm 1 knows that actually Farm 2 is going to assume the leadership position in the subsequent final good competition stage. Okay. So if it is incentive compatible for Farm 1 to accept such an order so that it gets more payoff, okay, by supplying input at this higher price to the Farm 2, who would now act as a leader in the subsequent stages of production. So that if that incentive compatibility is satisfied, then you will have a situation that where Farm 2 actually places its order with Farm 1 despite having a higher input price. So now is it clear that in all these modules what we are trying to see is that it is not the simple cost consideration that we were thinking in the beginning during the Coase-Williamson structure, that we look at what is the market price and what is the possibility of that the contract will be breached, as compared to that situation whether you can produce in-house. Now, here what we are seeing, that even when we buy input from the market between the input sellers, we might like to accept an input price which is higher, because that might reveal certain information to the farm 1. Now, placing an order with farm 3 would mean that that would not be known to farm 1. So in that case, it will be a private order. But whereas if farm 2 places an order with farm 1, then farm 1, being the competitor in the subsequent stage, would be able to guess that, look, this is what the guy is buying from me, so it will be the final output decision of that guy, because obviously he is not buying to keep it idle as input in his factory. So it will offload the entire amount of output in the market. So what would be my best response when someone chooses leadership quantity? Your best response will be at that stage of the production, which is at the sub game where the production takes place, is to assume the followership position. And you, being farm 1, being a player with rational expectation, with perfect foresight, will be able to guess that, and then based on that, it will only accept that order of input at a price P1, provided that its overall payoff from the followership position from the output market and the profit from the input selling is greater than what it could be getting just by not selling input to farm 2, where farm 2 will be placing the order with farm 3. Okay, so this gives you an interesting extension. If you read the paper will look complicated, but if you try to construct an example, that would be a good learning for you. That just an example where you are able to show that farm 2 will place the order to take advantage of its subsequent competition in terms of a leadership quantity, and that action, despite paying higher prices, will fetch him greater profit. And in the same manner, the guy who is accepting this particular order and conceding to this leadership role in the quantity setting stage by farm 2 will be also incentive compatible for farm 1 to do so. So try to find out an example based on simple linear demand and all these features. Okay. This is an interesting paper. This came out in International Journal of Industrial Organization in 2011. In fact, this was the prime mover for some of my own outsourcing the papers that I wrote later, because I was quite frustrated with this overall paper. Okay, so the paper is developed in a very complicated fashion, and finally the message that they are driving home is very good and interesting, but it's very badly kind of executed. Okay, and so then I started thinking around this, and I found some of my own papers in this particular stream of research. Okay, so I think it would be a good understanding of the area. If you just go through the paper, just even if you don't understand, don't bother, just read through, and that will give you a kind of good exposure the complications related to this particular model. Okay, and here the idea is very simple. Idea is that if you place the order with somebody else and there is Kuno competition in the third stage, Kuno means that people are choosing quantities, then both firms who are actually participating in that Kuno production stage, I mean the quantity competition stage, will simply behave like their Kuno competitors. So they will be choosing their Kuno quantities. Okay. But on the other hand, if the farm 2 is placing the order with farm 1 and thereby making it known to farm 1 that it is actually placing the order of leadership quantity, and we know that there is one-to-one correspondence between the input and the output, and there is no other cost. So the entire amount that is procured as input from farm 1 will essentially be the amount of output that will be offloaded in the market. And in such a context, now the farm 1's consideration is that first whether to accept such an order, which is an order of a leadership quantity, okay? And if it does so, then in the subsequent subgame, what would be its best response? In the subsequent subgame, we know that if someone produces the leadership output, just look at the reaction function, okay? And reaction function of farm 1 here, and that's any ordinary reaction function that you do, but there you basically depict with respect to different quantities of your rival your own choice, okay? Now in this case, if your rival is producing leadership, then you know from your own reaction function your best point is the followership position, okay? And so that would be your the optimal kind of quantity choice in the next period. So now when you are accepting the order, you have the consideration that whether my overall payoff, that is payoff from selling inputs to farm 2 and thereby making the profit on my own production of input and selling that to farm 2, plus my profit from the followership position, these two together must be greater than if I simply do not accept any order from farm 2. So that means there will be a third stage Kurno competition. The input will be procured from the input seller at whatever the price the input seller is selling to this guy. And farm 1 is not simply participating in the input market because it is not accepting any order from farm 2, okay? So in that case, it will be the monopoly of the input sellers in the market, and farm 2 will be buying input from farm 3 at the monopoly price that will be charged by farm 3, okay? So between these two alternatives, now the farm 1 has the consideration that should I participate in the input market and thereby quote a price PO1, which may be even greater than P3, but still the guy that is farm 2 will accept this particular price and place the order of this leadership because he will gain in the process. That's his objective. And my objective is to also gain from from this exercise that I participate in the input market and thereby accept the order of the leadership quantity, and thereby I put myself in some kind of optimal track decision that I choose followership in the next stage of the game. Okay. So this is in a sense a kind of pre-commitment, and you will see plenty of such pre-commitment effect in the strategic context whenever you are thinking of any kind of interactions where some kind of game is being played and they are the dynamic games. So the choices of the previous periods or earlier will typically act as a pre-commitment for certain course of action. Okay, so is that clear? Any question at this point?
No, sir.
Okay, so let us move on with the next model. Now the next model will be some variation of the current model, and this model will do at length. So model 4 I didn't do at length because I was expecting that if you understand this particular problem, then you yourself will be able to calculate different numbers and then thereby establish the leadership equilibrium. And also let me tell you that there are many other equilibria possible and that you can show. So you read the paper. That's an IGIO paper written by 3 good authors. One of them is quite famous, Pradeep Dubey. This is Chen Dubey and Sen paper I'm talking about. And that the person is in Stony Brook Game Theory Center. So he has plenty of other papers also, Pradeep Dubey. And this paper is written with 2 of his students. So now we are moving on to the next model.
So that paper was from the International Journal
So
of
now you
Industrial.
have that is International Journal of Industrial Organization, 2011, and the reference is given in the syllabus. that reading list that I have put in the Piazza.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Understood that it's not simply the cost consideration, it is the strategic consideration what prompted firms to take decisions regarding outsourcing in the first place, and even if it is outsourcing, then from whom to outsource. Okay, there was some questions earlier regarding that offshoring and outsourcing to another country, but those outsourcing, if you look at it, those are at one level very simple because they are done by cost consideration. At the second level, those outsourcing or offshoring activity in the trade literature, they call it that you are able to increase the variety of inputs that you are procuring from different countries. So when the number of input varieties increase, then that helps in the overall production. So the production is based on different varieties of input. So that is helpful. Okay. And also sometimes those varieties are also is the love for variety by the consumer. So overall, through trade and offshoring of certain activities to different countries and buying inputs of different kinds and producing outputs of different kinds, they actually increase the overall economic activity that leads to growth often, and that's the reason for offshoring, and that those are profitable as well. But in all these considerations, so if you look at simple cost consideration, then they are not strategic reasons for outsourcing. Okay, strategic reasons means that you are trying to take certain advantages in the strategic competition, and to do take that advantages you are doing the outsourcing, then we call that strategic outsourcing. And just the previous model gives you a clear strategic consideration that the guy who is placing the order is trying to assume the role of a leadership. The earlier also we have talked about this biometrics game where people are actually choosing in-house production and outsourcing, and there also the strategic considerations are playing a role. Okay, so now let us move to another model, and this model again, this is a published one, 2008, most probably Management Science. You can check that because this set of authors have two articles. One is in Management Science, another is in another journal. So as far as I remember, I'm teaching you the Management Science article, but you can check that. Okay, so outsourcing with playing favorites, that's the main thrust point of this article. Now again, I will stick to the same setup. Farm 3 input supplier. Now in place of farm 2, I'm thinking that farm 2 is actually an entrant which is entering late. Okay, there is an incumbent which is the farm 1 already in the market, and this incumbent has both upstream and downstream. So if you look at the structure, this is exactly the same as the previous one. Okay, in terms of the farm's capability, farm 1 having both capabilities, upstream, downstream. Then only thing we'll be doing is that there is this entrant which is having only downstream capability like the previous model, but entrant means it enters late. Okay, so which means that the input supplier would be setting prices for this entrant which will be at a different stage as compared to the price that it charges to the incumbent. Okay, so the choice of prices will be in sequential manner for the two farms by the input seller, that is farm 3. And this is the difference with the previous model in terms of the structure, and of course the game will have a little bit of difference in terms of timeline. Okay, both units. So if you imagine that how the literature and the research are progressing, this was a paper in 2008. The earlier paper that I just talked about is in 2011. Okay, so if you are clever, if you are interested in playing out your hands in different ideas and try to research, you can see nothing has changed. Everything is similar. Now we are looking at a very interesting possibility that how this farm 3 can actually discriminate between the two final good producers, and that will determine the market outcome. Clear? Okay. So how the game is played? Game is the following. Input seller first sets W1 for the incumbent firm. And incumbent firms has both options of buy or make. That means it can produce in-house also. So I decide whether to buy or make. Now once these things are done, oh my God, again it has started misbehaving. Anyway, so can you see whatever is there? Okay. So are you with me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay, fine. So yeah. So IS first sets a price for incumbent and then E enters, the second firm enters and IS sets W2 for second firm. Okay. And then I and E chooses Q1 and Q2 simultaneously. So we are assuming that this will be a simple Kurno game. Okay. Goods sold and profits are realized. So this is our timeline. Game ends. 3 stages. One stage is I sets W1 and for I, and then I decides whether to accept this or to make input. E enters, I set something, and then E chooses, then E doesn't have any option of producing in-house. So this W2 is quoted, and if it is worthwhile for E to remain in the market and produce, then only it will do. So when IS sets price W2 for the input, it knows that this W2 might be so high that it can actually induce the entrant to stay out of the market. So that option is also available. But we'll be looking at a situation where the entrant enters and IS charges lower price. That's where the playing favoritism comes. So given that incumbent was there in the market, you can call that they have